So I teach history and political science at the University of Michigan. And when I'm teaching undergraduates at the university, I usually start my courses by explaining what I mean by the 5 cons of history. 5 elements that I believe good historians should consider, maybe not fully consciously, to organize their material, their selection of relevant facts, and to frame their arguments and explanations. These cons are the following: context, conjuncture, contingency, contradiction, and confusion. This morning, I'd like to use these 5 historical concepts to tell you about my own understanding of the history and legacy 100 years ago of the First Republic of Armenia, and how that history, what we remember and understand about that republic, might illuminate today what is happening in Armenia and what might we expect. You all know better than I that as a people, Armenians are more often under the control of their history than they are in control of it. Events in the past, far distant past often, deeply, almost fatally influence our thinking about ourselves, and we ponder victories and defeats of decades, even centuries ago. We replay them, we refight them, and therefore we reproduce over and over again ancient divisions and conflicts. Take, for example, as I will today, the bizarre circumstances in which the First Republic of Armenia emerged. Imagine the tragic events that surrounded the fall of that republic and the Dashna government in Yerevan in November and December 1920. Think about the establishment of Soviet power and then a revolt against that power. Some would call it abstanbutyun, others would call it khorovutyun, mutiny, you can take your pick, of February to April 1921. These distant events are still the subject of argument and mutual accusation among Armenians, as if what happened then gives legitimacy to one side and eliminates the political claims of the other. Now, for historians, and I hope other social scientists as well, the most important factors ought to be, but seldom are, not what political effects their telling of the story will have, but the actual events themselves. What happened? Why did that happen? How might we interpret and understand those events? To accomplish that task, historians turn to original sources as far as they can obtain them. They analyze the fullest possible documentation as intelligently and fairly as possible. And though we understand that complete objectivity is never really possible, as Karl Marx said, who educated the educator? We all come from somewhere. Still, the obligation of historians is to be fair and open about our biases, our methods, our sources, so that readers may then judge how that history was constructed. Therefore, I propose that these 5 important aspects of historical understanding must be brought to bear on these problems. So here they are again. Context. The social, political, cultural, and intellectual environment in which the events took place, as well as the time when those events occurred. Spaces, environments, temporalities. Secondly, conjuncture. The play of large historical processes, revolutions, wars, economic situations. Contingency, the effect of particular events, of accidents, of personalities, of the selection and use of ideologies. contradictions, as any good Marxist would know, anomalies, things that don't fit in easily together, that often run in a different direction from what the historian might prefer. And finally, confusion. That is the humility that we must bring, and the understanding that we cannot know everything and that all questions cannot be comfortably answered. So, let's begin. What is the context then of the establishment of that first Republic of Armenia? Well, think of three dates: 1914, 1915, and 1917. The broadest and most important context was the devastating landscape of World War I, a cataclysmic bloodletting in which tens of millions of people were killed, other tens of millions were crippled, displaced, and forced from their normal places of living. For Armenians, the context includes the massacres, deportations, and forced conversions, those three processes that have been recognized worldwide now as the Armenian genocide. We must add to these the revolutions that convulsed Russia in 1917 and continued for the next 5 years in a deadly, bloody civil war. Those revolutions, ironically, in Russia, extended the life of the moribund, dying Ottoman Empire for a few more years. But ultimately, the end of that war created the vacuum, the emptiness between the powers, between the Ottomans and the Russians, those empires that for centuries had dominated or occupied Armenia, and that vacuum provided the brief, fleeting possibility of Armenians creating their own state. Armenian independence, as we still know today, is always precarious. And it came into existence in May 1918, not as something that Armenians desired. Its leadership was reluctant to declare independence, but rather came about as the result of an unpredicted political opportunity, the withdrawal of Russia and the imminent collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Thus, the context, the first con, in which the First Republic emerged was exit from empire and exit from catastrophic genocidal violence. Think about the creation of the Third Republic, of this republic. That is, it also occurred as the exit from empire and a moment of collapse of the center. As Levon Ter-Petrosyan once said, it's not us who exited, it's they who left us. The Soviet Union committed suicide. In the vacuum created by the retreat of the Russians in 1918, the Armenian political leaders in Tiflis declared Armenia an independent state, and that state managed a brief and difficult survival for about 2.5 years, largely through the efforts of its own people and its then preferred political leaders, the Dashnaktsutun. And though timely, through some timely but severely limited aid from Great Britain and the United States. Think about it. Independence was possible only because two rival powers no longer could stop Armenians from becoming independent. And it lasted only as long as those two rival powers, until they reconstituted themselves into Bolshevik Russia and Kemalist Turkey, and then snuffed out the fragile, improbable, abandoned state that lay between them. Perhaps it's a sad law of history, one I learned, by the way, from my own teacher, Nina Garsoyan, that Armenia can survive as an independent state only when the surrounding powers are weak or failed states or somehow equally balanced or protected by the international system. Otherwise, the fate of the Armenians is to be either divided between those imperial powers or dominated by one or the other, which is more powerful. So what about the particular conjuncture of forces that allowed first the existence of independent Armenia and then determined its fall? This is closely related to the context in which Armenians found themselves, but the conjuncture also involved the failure of Western powers to come effectively to the aid of the small, isolated republic that actually aspired to create a democratic state between rival autocracies. Without a benefactor from outside, whether it was the United States or Britain, independent Armenia was unable to survive on its own once it was faced by the rival ambitions of the Kemalists and the Bolsheviks. Note that in this particular context, in this particular conjuncture of forces, the actions and desires of Armenians was largely irrelevant. They were not powerful agents on their own, able to secure their security, and rather they were acted on by rival powers. Does this sound familiar? Their fate was largely, though not entirely, decided by themselves. So here we already have contingency. The contingency of choices and ideological preferences. The ways in which the then leaders, the Dashnak Suchur, imagined the world, which side they chose to join, these became also important factors in the country's fate. Now, whether or not they were ultimately decisive, it's difficult to say. There are lots of accidents in history, but it's hard also to deny that there were mistakes made by Armenian leaders. First of all, the Dashnak Suchun had immense geographical ambitions, ambitions which were far too great for their physical means to achieve. They, in fact, engaged in what some political scientists call imperial overreach, trying to get too much with too little. Many states do that. My own country, the United States, Russia, also try that. They identified, secondly, most closely with their Western allies, which meant that both to the Kemalists and to the Bolsheviks, they were pawns of the imperialists, a bourgeois power. The Dashnaks, who ruled the republic, were seen by both Moscow and Ankara, as enemies of the International Socialist Revolution, or the Turkish National Revolution, and the anti-colonialist aims of both Bolsheviks and Kemalists. Among the contingencies, that is, the particular events and personalities that might have moved history in a different direction, one should again consider the views of the political leaders, their ideologies and aspirations, their willfulness, and their errors of perception and judgment. I've written about this elsewhere in Looking Toward Ararat. Ultimately, the failure of independent Armenia was, I'd say, not the fault of either the leaders or their adversaries. It was not the result alone of Dashnak incompetence or aggressiveness, though they are not completely, entirely blameless. I take what I call here a radical middle position between the structural features and the agency of the leaders. Giving up their Russian orientation for a European orientation in 1918, the Dashnaks could have said, and it's reasonable to think, that this was a move that was perfectly pragmatic in that moment that Russia was so weak. But it was a gamble. Indeed, it was quite a long shot, as leaving the Russian orientation proved to be the early years of the Third Republic under Ter-Petrosyan. Once the Soviets moved into the Caucasus in 1920, taking Baku, Azerbaijan, in April, the Dashnaks were faced with a new peril. Soviet Russia would not unconditionally support a republic linked to the Western imperialist powers and ruled by a party with a long history of antagonism to the Bolsheviks. The Dashnaks, of course, might have acted more quickly to attract Soviet support. They might have also been less provocative toward the Turkish nationalists. But ultimately, they were the victims of the requirements of larger powers. Before I consider the last two cons, contradiction and confusion, let's take a look at the fall of the Republic and the last-ditch effort to restore the Republic after the Soviet takeover. So, what was the context of the Sovietization of Armenia in November, December 1920, and then the February 1921 revolt. By the spring of 1920, the communists were reestablishing the power of the Russian central government over the independent republics of what had been the Russian Tsarist Empire. The Russian Civil War was coming to an end in 1920, and the foreign interventionists which had prolonged that war now and aided the establishment of national republics in the Baltics, in Ukraine, elsewhere, were withdrawing from the scene. By 1920, the political situation had changed drastically. Turkey was reviving under the Kemalists, and the communists had emerged triumphant in the Russian Civil War. And here was little Armenia, caught between the advancing Turks and the Red Army in Azerbaijan. And the Dashnags chose, at one point, out of necessity, to make a political agreement with the communists and enter a coalition government. What was the conjuncture, the particular conjuncture of 1920-21 that in fact influenced these events? Well, the Bolshevik victory in the Russian Civil War, the successes of the Kemalist movement, and a particular government now under Lenin in Moscow that was interested most in its own security and in promoting a very ambitious and ultimately failing international socialist revolution. Realizing that a new stabilization was underway in the Western capitalist world, the Comintern leaders turned toward the non-Western world, toward the Muslim Middle East, toward India, and to a lesser extent China, in the hope that the revolution in what we now call the Third World would undermine British imperialism and accelerate the revolution in Europe. This was the theme of the famous Baku Congress of the Peoples of the East in September 1920, a congress in which the Armenian issue was seriously discussed. And it remained a conscious calculation in the policy of Soviet Russia toward Armenia in the next few years. So here the fate of Armenia was subordinated by the Kremlin to the larger problem of revolution in the Muslim world and to the strategy of gaining allies among Turkish and Persian nationalists. To put it bluntly, as I did in looking toward Ararat, Armenia was expendable to the Soviets and always subordinate to Russia's revolutionary goals. This was a particularly harsh environment. With Western Europe largely denuded of Armenians after the genocide, and in the hands of the triumphant Kemalists, only Eastern Armenia, this little territory here, that had been under Persia up to 1828, that then part of the Russian Empire in 1917, only that little part remained under the control of Armenians by the end of 1920. But in Europe, they were already giving up on Armenia, beginning with the London Conference in February, and then at San Remo in April. Britain, France, and Italy made it clear that despite their sympathy for the Armenians' losses and the loyalty of the Armenians to the Entente, they would not use force to guarantee the existence of the Republic. A vain hope was held out that the United States might come to an end to its help, but that also failed when Wilson failed to get the mandate through the Congress. The Azerbaijanis, on the other hand, were already moving into Karabakh when the Red Army took the capital, Baku. That taking of Baku radically changed the balance of power in the South Caucasus. Now the Soviets were the major power that would determine the fate of Armenia. And they began to encourage local Bolsheviks, who had very little support in the country, both in Georgia and Armenia, to launch rebellions. For a while, the ruling Mensheviks in Georgia and the ruling Dashnags in Yerevan brutally suppressed the communists. The May uprising in Armenia by the Reds brought down the moderate government in Yerevan, which was then replaced by a party dictatorship made up of Dashnag Bureau members. Note that the enemies of democracy include rebels sometimes, these Reds, and also war. War between states, civil wars within states, also help cripple the possibilities of democracy. This again may sound very familiar today. But there was something else going on, which is difficult to talk about. All three of the newly formed South Caucasian republics were aiming to create ethnically homogeneous states with their own people dominating in a national territory. Now, Caucasia was an imperial borderland in which different peoples were complexly mixed, where they had lived for centuries together. And suddenly, governments of Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, as well as independent military figures like Antranik and Nijder, set out to create facts on the ground, a policy of nationalizing the territory they could hold. The term ethnic cleansing had not yet been invented. The Dashnag leaders of Armenia had to deal with a weak and unreliable army and large numbers of Muslims within the borders of their republic. And they embarked on a nationalizing policy, first requiring Armenian language for all state employees, dismissing Russian officials, and mandating the use of the Armenian in the courts. The liberal citizenship law of June 5th, 1920, did recognize all inhabitants of the republic who had formerly been Russian or Turkish subjects to be citizens of Armenia, and provisions were made for foreign Armenians to apply for citizenship. But at the very same time, the government launched military campaigns against Muslim villages, driving Kurds and Turks beyond the former Russo-Turkish border. That frontier region, which had been lost by Ottoman Turkey to Tsarist Russia in 1878, was contested, of course, by the Kemalist nationalists, who refused to recognize Armenian claims to what Armenians considered their historic territory. Even more ominously for Armenia, when its army attempted to move into Muslim-populated Nakhichevan, the way was barred by Soviet and Turkish troops linked to a pseudo-Red alliance. In July, the British garrison in Batumi, the last Allied troops in Transcaucasia, withdrew, leaving the Armenians alone before most powerful enemies. Such policies were based, of course, on the increasingly influential discourse of the nation. The discourse of the nation that held that a nation, however conceived, required a definite, distinct territory of its own in which it dominated. That discourse, that culture and language and history gave one the right to rule a piece of the world's real estate and to dominate it. That discourse gave you the right to an independent state. These efforts at nation-state building, which meant the excision of other peoples, created deep hostilities and anxieties between the peoples of the South Caucasus, dividing them for the next century, divisions and hostilities, regrettably, that we know remain to the present time. The unmixing of peoples, the opposite of imperial mixing of peoples, was embedded in the very creation of the three republics. For the next 70 years under the Soviets, those conflicts would be muted. They would not take place in armed warfare, of course, maybe on the soccer field, a football field, but not between states. That would all end with the end of the Soviet Empire. Armenians tried, in that same period, diplomatically to enhance the power and existence of their state in different ways with different representations, but with the Allies backing away, Armenia's independent future increasingly depended upon themselves and on what outsiders would do with Armenia. And what's interesting is in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet Republic at the time, there was a big debate between moderates and radicals. Moderates who believed, like Foreign Minister Georgy Checherin, that we could have an independent Armenian state, an independent Georgia, that would have good relations with Soviet Russia. But there were also militants like Sergo Orjonikidze, and another, then rather obscure Georgian communist, Joseph Jugashvili, Joseph Stalin. And they pushed for a far more revolutionary or military takeover of the remaining South Caucasian republics. Interestingly enough, Lenin was among the moderates at first. And he was willing, particularly with Georgia, which was a Menshevik socialist government, creating a bourgeois republic, to think at least about some of these other kinds of arrangements. But then the endgame began for the republic and the victory of the militants or the radicals among the Bolsheviks. In September 1920, Turkish troops launched an attack across the former Russian-Turkish border, and events moved quickly. Though Moscow was sympathetic to the anti-imperialist agenda of the Kemalists, both sides were suspicious of the intentions of the other regarding the South Caucasus. And so a variety of diplomatic efforts occurred, and the Armenians fought valiantly to maintain their republic. But then a demoralized Armenian army at Kars panicked, losing the fortress town on October 30th to the forces of General Kazim Karabekir, and effectively sealing the fate of the Armenian Republic. The Turkish army occupied Alexandropol, Gumri, and advanced toward Karaklisa, forcing the Armenian government to sign a humiliating armistice. Worried by the Turkish successes, Soviet Russia offered to mediate the conflict. Yerevan and Ankara agreed. One set of negotiations directly with the Turks took place in Alexandropol. Another went on with the Soviet plenipotentiaries in Yerevan. At that very moment, communists launched yet another rebellion on November 29th and declared Armenia a Soviet Socialist Republic, and the Red Army began to move in. One can say that at the moment of Sovietization, Armenia was at the nadir, the lowest point of its modern history. Not only had Armenians been murdered massively and driven out of the Turkish-held parts of the Armenian plateau in the genocide, but the population of Russian Armenia, of this republic, had also fallen precipitously since the outbreak of World War I because of warfare, migration, and disease. By 1920, only 720,000 people lived in eastern Armenia, a decline of some 30%. Moreover, almost half the population was made up of refugees. Many of the social and political institutions of the Armenians in the Caucasus and in Turkey that had been built up over centuries had been destroyed. The Armenian middle class, our bourgeoisie, the once privileged elite of Tiflis and Baku, was now suspect in the eyes of the new Soviet governments in Georgia and Azerbaijan, and their unenviable choice was either to accommodate themselves to the alien socialist order or to emigrate to the West. In other words, war, genocide, revolution, civil war, all resulted in many ways in demodernizing Armenia, throwing this little republic back to its pre-capitalist agrarian economy and more traditionally peasant-based society. And that then, when the first Soviet government came in, unpopular as it was, it tried to carry out a very radical social change. It broke its agreement. The first Herkom, the first Revolutionary Committee, led by Kasyan, broke that agreement and carried out repressive measures against the Dashnak Suchun. And that led ultimately to this Abstanbuchun, this revolt against them a few months later, when the Red Army moved from Armenia into Georgia to complete the Sovietization of Georgia. So here's where contingency comes in. The accident of who came to rule in those first months in Armenia and tried to carry out a rather radical social change, the kind of thing that the former speaker, in fact, warned us against. And this completely inexperienced young government lost authority immediately and lost power in Yerevan rather quickly. The rapidity and harshness of the communist initial policies created great dissatisfaction with the Soviet government. And so the Dashnags briefly came back to power. They opened up the prisons to find many murdered comrades. Even someone like Hovhannes Kachazluni, the former prime minister who had stayed behind in Yerevan, was briefly arrested. But he only remained there 8 days. The Red Army was no longer functioning, and the Dashnags briefly held sway. Ultimately, they lost, held out in Zangezur before moving into Persia. Ultimately, the rebellion failed, but it had a positive and long-lasting effect, a rather sobering effect on the communists. Moscow replaced the militant Herkom with a new government headed by the shrewd, competent Alexander Myasnikov, or Myasnikyan, a man trained in the law, but with a long period of service fighting on the Western Front during the Russian Civil War. He was commissioned by Lenin to carry out the more moderate policy toward the Caucasus. It was also true that Russia was moving from war communism, военный коммунизм, to NEP, Novaya Ekonomicheskaya Politika, and it was also moderating. And so Lenin warned the new communists now in power that they ought to exercise, and I'm quoting now, greater gentleness, caution, concessions in dealing with the petty bourgeoisie, that's us, the intelligentsia, that's some of us, and especially the peasantry, that's also some of us, unquote. Lenin was suspicious that many communists were not sensitive to local and ethnic peculiarities, that their internationalism, so-called, their calls for unity with Soviet Russia were really disguised forms of Russian nationalism. As he once said, scratch a communist and you will find a great Russian chauvinist. I think that's even more true today in Moscow than ever before. A degree of autonomy for the smaller nationalities was necessary, he believed, in order to win them over to the Soviet cause. So, a republic was formed, which we can call the Second Republic. I just was at a conference in New York where they forgot that republic altogether and called the current republic the Second Republic. But I think fairly, in history, there was a First Republic, a Soviet Second Republic, a Third Republic, and maybe we're moving on to a fourth, more democratic republic. So where were contradiction and confusion in my analysis? Well, they come later. And they're with us today. When historians again, and activists, and ordinary people cast their gaze on the fraught events backwards to 1918 and 1921 and think about Armenia 100 years later. 100 years after the establishment of the First Republic, not only that story remains a source of contention, there's another con, and confusion. Not only do questions remain unanswered, not only for some is that republic a blaze of glory and for others a matter of defeat and humiliation, but one can say that that republic, without that republic, there may never have been a second republic, a Soviet republic. So the heritage of the First Republic is found in the Second and the Third Republic, both good and bad. My own reading is, as I've tried to indicate, that the First Republic was too ambitious in its attempts to create a greater Armenia, that it outreached its own possibilities and means, and that's a warning to us today as well. Ultimately, it couldn't do much to improve conditions for the Armenians. But then, as I said, the Soviets were also overly ambitious at first. The excesses of the first Soviet government were the principal cause of the rebellion and resistance that was, and these were understandable and justified. In other words, maybe the two smartest words in the Armenian language are gamats, gamats, yavash, yavash, right? Nela, nela in Georgian. Things have to go more slowly, but more permanently. The revolt was a warning. The Soviets now considered more moderate policies, even though those ultimately who would win out, like Ordzhonikidze and Stalin, would ultimately produce a Soviet policy of radical change. I would end by saying that the story of the tiny Armenian state 100 years ago hovers between tragedy and pathos. It can be told as a tale of circumstances beyond Armenian capabilities or the failures of its leaders, but I think it's a little bit of both. And that Armenian leaders, when they're intelligent, when they're in touch with their own people, can in fact affect their history in ways that are not possible when they lose touch with the nation. In the century that followed, that initial effort to found a democratic republic would be repeatedly revived. Armenians time and again would attempt to turn even the Soviets into a more democratic, more responsive regime. And at the very moment, to the credit of the people in the city of Yerevan and throughout the country, that movement, that aspiration for democracy is being renewed in the streets and the halls of the government, and all we can do is hope that this time it will succeed.